现在开始。今天呢，我们很高兴邀请到这个CAFA事务所的合伙人来给我们做一个讲座。这个也是前段时间我们在威尼斯碰见了，跟Patrik邀请了Patrik，他非常这个欣然的就这个同意来我们的学校做一个讲座。当然我们也希望这个下一步还有更紧密的在教学方面这样的一些合作。那么今天呢，他给我们带来的一个讲座呢，是我觉得是一个在我们以前看来，这个CAFA事务所超越了以前CAFA事务所这个从事的这个参数化设计的一些领域的这样的一些新的这个理论和内容和实践。这个我们想大家都知道这个CAFA事务所在这个参数化设计领域，应该说是在国际上是非常一直是起到一种引导作用。那么在这个参数化的实践方面，应该说是有了大量的一个作品。那么今天呢，我觉得Patrik先生呢给我们会带来一个新的这个视角，也就是说，在参数化这个设计领域，如何在城市方面、城市设计方面发挥一些作用。那么我想，今天这个讲座一定是会对我们非常有启示的。那么，以热烈掌声欢迎Patrik给我们开始他的演讲。
Welcome everybody. Thanks for the introduction. We'll roughly speak for an hour, perhaps. It might take a little longer through because we want to translate some of the phrases. Who doesn't speak English here? Most. Who would like to have a translation? Ask in Chinese.
有需要翻译吗？
还是需要的。
那其实今天翻译大概就是简单翻译，不会逐句翻译。
我刚刚忘介绍的就是今天给我们担任翻译的呢，也是CAFA事务所的郑伟建筑师。
Okay, so you should tell them that we have some Chinese character and that will be summary translations only, so that at least the key elements of the argument will be clear, but not a full translation of them.
对，就是今天我们好像今天准备的时候已经给大家加好了中文注释，所以就是不会是逐句翻译，但是会大概翻译概要。
Okay, great. So, and after the lecture, I'm hoping for some interaction with respect to questions and answers.
然后之后我们希望会有大家就是讲过之后，大家会有热烈的问题啊，或者是 Q&A session。
You don't have to read this. This is and the general sense of urban disorder, visual chaos, and urban ugliness. Nothing beautiful has been created on an urban scale in the last 30 to 40 years.
就是今天主要讲的就是说，因为我们现在目前面临的这个城市规划，就是在过去20到30年之内呢，我们的城市建设是越来越混乱的。然后我们想看一下我们如何探讨一个新的城市秩序。
So we need to discuss why this is the case and if we can do anything about it.
然后我们想看一下，就是为什么我们现在城市规划的混乱程度如此之高，然后看我们如何解决这样的问题。
And I don't think the solution is, of course, and what I see, for a lot of architects to pull away from dense cities and concern themselves with the countryside or with hutongs and small-scale projects and say, I have nothing to do with this menacing chaos. That's, I think, cannot be the answer of our discipline.
就是我认为解决办法不应该是我们远离城市 高密度的城市建设而去乡村改造或者是胡同建设，我们应该是面对问题。
So there's no chance. We have to address the metropolis and see whether we can continue with the density, vitality, and complexity of the city, but give it a legibility and urban order which is also gives it a sense of beauty again.
就是我们应该城市规划还是回到那个都市中去，然后如何让那个建筑更有可读性。
So the premise is that we are living in the age of mega concentration, and that's the thesis I want to offer is that only a hegemonic parametricism can make an urban order and beauty compatible with unleashed market processes, because the urbanization process of the last 30 years was out of control of any central planning authority and has been mainly market-driven, entrepreneurial-driven, and I support that and accept this aspect and want to see how the discipline can cope with this and gain some sense of control over it, but control which is not prescriptive.
就是我们认为只有那个参数化主义才能适应我们现在的那个市场经济，因为我们现在经济体制是以市场为主导的，然后只有参数化主义能给城市一定的空间秩序。
So just very briefly rehearse some of the key concepts of parametricism. We've been working on this concept for the last 15, nearly 20 years, and I think that has developed a very sophisticated, mature methodology, a set of new repertoires which can offer a solution to the contemporary urban condition.
就是参数化主义是我们过去15到20年推出的一种解决我们现在建筑的一个解决办法。
And then, before I go into the more theoretical part, I just want to give you an overview of works Zadi the architects have created in all program categories, in all scales, and across all design disciplines. And just as a reminder that there is a repertoire and the capacity to tackle built environment, and then discuss on that basis the urban order problem.
就是在我们讲理论之前，我想先给大家看一下我们那个事务所在各个尺度各种功能的一些案例，然后之后我们会探讨这些案例如何在理论下支持的。
So I've been showing these kind of animation for a while to indicate that we're working very differently than traditional architecture. All traditional architecture of the last 5,000 years was based on these geometric primitives, and those primitives were assembled into classical figures, but also all of modernism is still based on this, on the composition and arrangement of these simple forms, which remain pure.
就是我们传统的建筑呢，一直是利用固有的几何图形，然后以它们做排列组合，然后形成的那个变化性不是很多的建筑体系。
This is an image, a diagram which I took out of Le Corbusier. So even for Le Corbusier, architecture resolves itself into the composing of these simple solids as the basic repertoire to create the built environment.
这个图片是他从科布的那个一张手绘上找出来的，说即使是科布，他在做设计的时候也是只是仅仅用固有的几何图形把它们组合出来。
Except that in modernism, the rules of composition are slightly expanded. You can arrange them in asymmetric configurations, and you're also no longer bound by systems of proportion, but it's still just a combination of these elements.
就是即使在现代主义的时候，我们虽然不受那个尺度的限制， 但是也仅仅就是把这些几个图形拼接起来。
And what I'm showing here is that with our computationally enhanced design methodologies, we have a much expanded repertoire of elements which are parametrically malleable and therefore able to interconnect, to fit into complex contexts, and to adapt to each other continuously and deliver continuous variation and complexity like the complex variegated order of nature.
这个左边就是我们新的那个原型元素，我们用那个曲面曲线，然后来实现这个建筑之间互相的联系。
So the spirit of pragmatism is to have always adaptation to complex contexts, to pick up lines, fabrics, volumes, continuity, and then to differentiate and create variation and qualitative differences, but not in a random juxtaposition, but with a sense of continuity of evolution, so that these kind of environments become navigable, it's easy to orient, yet they pick up a set of complexity, which is the new kind of complexity contemporary society needs.
就是参数化设计是我们想实现一种多样性、复杂性，然后又有连续性的一种设计，然后也是能更好的让那个我们的设计与周围的那个城市环境相联系。
But these kind of urban projects, they're quite large projects and they're given to single master planners. But the problem is much bigger. We have to think through how is it possible to have a coherent urban texture across many different projects, many authors, multiple authors, with independent entrepreneurs and independent developers, initiatives. How could that all come together and make sense as one global urban order? That's the challenge.
就是我们现在面临的挑战是，我们现在城市设计并不是由一个人做的，所以我们如何建立一种体系，让不同的作者，然后能在城市规划的过程中能实现这种统一，然后有连贯的设计。
So I want to point you to this publication which just came out, an ID which I collected, a series of the mature key protagonists of pragmatism, and have prefaced the issue with an introduction which looks forward to maturing this particular paradigm to take on responsibility for the built environment globally. So I'm focusing attention on arguing for the societal relevance of these principles of parametricism, of differentiation, correlation, communication, and focus this discipline, in particular this group of protagonists, on the problem of social functionality, and no longer primary focus on technological issues. Of course, with this new work there's a lot of technology issues to be solved, but we need to start convincing society at large and convince ourselves that these are not only beautiful and fascinating possibilities for architecture, but they are necessary elements to develop a vital urban order.
就是这个是刚刚出版的参数化主义2.0，然后在这本书里收集了一些活跃在参数化主义从08年到现在的一些，还是活跃在学术界啊什么工业界的一些主角。但是我们现在想把我们的那个主要的那个目标转移到如何从解决科技问题转移到如何使这个参数化设计更适应我们现在的市场，然后更适应我们现在的社会结构。
So, what I'm talking about in the lecture, you can kind of study in this particular article, for instance. So some of the arguments I'm making are reversed and written there, so you can pick that up and study that. I will now just quickly click through a lot of the images of our work, mostly built across scales, just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about when I then addresses the theoretical issues. So I'll just move through this very quickly.
所以我们现在给大家看一下我们事务所所见的一些案例，非常快速的。
Sometimes I stop. So we're interested in situations like this where you have a lot of simultaneous connection vistas. You're here inside looking outside, looking through the outside back to the inside. There are deep complex vistas in these projects, and the space keeps moving and drifting and is ever changing. It never stops, it's never contained, and has moments of complexity and choice. And also I think it's important the way it embeds itself into a context, picking up historical building, making up connections to fabric. So it's just a good example of the expanded repertoire, working with curves, working with bifurcations, working with field conditions, how this could create a new original solution.
这个就是这个案例呢，我们想给大家讲的就是建筑的内部和外部如何联系，如何通过这个刚才走廊的剥离来创造一种这个视觉关联，然后以及这个我们外体的流线如何跟城市肌理相连。
Just to briefly explain this one as well, what we are interested in, what we're focusing on, to use architectural and compositional means to give visual legibility to the built environment. So we're accommodating function like a car park, a tram stop, a bus stop, a kind of interchange. But we're focusing on communicating these functions and making an overall life process visible and navigable.
就是我们的设计主要是想让这个建筑的提高建筑的可读性，然后我们想加强这个各种功能之间的交流。
So we have 2 car parks on 2 sides of the street, and this kind of with the bus stop and the tram station, usually this would just look like more stuff like this. It would disappear and fall apart. But we are interested to articulate the unity of interaction and give presence and orientation to this. So we're using graphic means to tie the 2 car parks together, to tie together the car park with the tram and bus station, and use curvature to connect smoothly various elements and articulate unity rather than allowing a disarticulated, disoriented ensemble to confuse us. And for me, this artistic inverted commas treatment is highly functional because these spaces are functioning through navigation, orientation, and cognitive agents need to find each other and find their way. And that is part of the functionality, key part of the functionality.
就是我们通过视觉上连接这2个停车场，然后让这个建筑的可视性更高了，然后从此连接了。就是如果传统做设计的话，这个停车场跟那个公交车站还有我们的这个楼是分开的，然后现在我们把它连在一起呢，就是实现了更好的功能性交流。
So just to explain how this works, all the pragmatic elements, there's nothing superfluous here. These are all car parks, lighting, the street is there, everything that we need is there, but everything you need is brought under a ruthless formalism and participates in a visual operation, an orienting operation.
就是我们想强调的是视觉关系跟那个方向的关系。
So everything has a double function, the pragmatic function of giving light or allocating a space, and a navigation function or communication function. And that's why we make choices. For instance, these lampposts, they are growing larger as they come around. they are made similar to the demarcations, so that all these elements, even if they have different pragmatic functions, are part of a strong formal language, a swarm condition which leads you through, and then you have lampposts becoming light columns, demarcations become slashes and lights on the roof, and the tram is mirrored by a cut in the roof, etc. So in the end, you have the ceiling of the roof and the floor becoming part of one language, so they're what I call formally affiliated. So what I'm talking about is a strong formalism is a strong performance.
就像比如说我们那个设计的这个灯柱，它既有功能上的意义，就是指引这个在夜晚指引车辆，但是它又有这个从交流功能从那个连接上的意义，因为它的那个大小还有那个灯的那个长度都是指引大家的指引方向。
So for me, composition and aesthetic control are not secondary or opposed to social functionality. They are vital aspects of social functionality.
就是在他看来呢，建筑设计呢不应该是与社会的那个功能关系相悖的。
Okay, I will not explain all the projects within this degree of detail, so now I'll just go through more images and then I will address the theoretical issues.
大家快速的看一下我们其他的一些案例。
Maybe just to say one more thing, with an unusual expanded repertoire, so we're no longer just doing boxes, cylinders, roofs, we have much more freedom of composition, means we also can do unusual original solutions, like a bridge which is at the same time a gallery.
就是根据我们那个设计工具的越来越大化，我们现在可以不是简单的只做那个基本几个图形的组合，我们现在也有功能性，又可以加速有功能性，比如说这个又是个桥，但是它同时又可以是一个展览馆。
So I'm suggesting that an expanded formal repertoire means an enhanced and expanded problem-solving repertoire.
就是结构的设计方法，其实也是我们真正解决设计问题的一种方法，形态上设计方法。
So you can see that we're working on urban scale, architectural scale, we're also working into interiors, furniture, products, fashion, graphic, because all these design disciplines participate in giving, in visual communication. For me, all design is communication design.
就是我们不仅只做那个建筑设计，我们也做室内家具，还有一些那个时尚的设计。然后对我而言，其实设计不仅仅是形态上设计，也应该是一种交流关系的设计。
And you find the same division of labor between engineers in charge of technical aspects and designers in charge of the communicative, visual, tactile, expressive aspects. You find that in all the design disciplines. You have that in industrial design, furniture design, as well as in architecture.
就像是工程师应该着重于解决技术问题，而建筑师应该着重解决交流关系的问题。
You also have this in website design, graphic design. There's always technical aspect and then design aspects. And the design aspect is, of course, the primary social functionality. And then the next question is what about the technical translation?
就是我们面临着技术问题的同时，也面临着这个我们设计上的问题。就是我们建筑师应该着重于如何实现我们设计上的问题，但同时也是要解决技术上的问题。
And as you can see here, we're also interested in fashion, jewelry, and these are all media of communication, very important, and society couldn't function out without that.
然后我们也做过一些这个首饰啊，还有一些室内的设计，家具的设计。然后从这个也能看出，设计是加强社会交流关系的一个媒介。
This is a small building which connects to 2 historical buildings and swings around a tree, so you can see how our language is very malleable and adaptive and can fit intricately into complex given situation. It doesn't rely on its own tabula rasa side, but can go into complex situation and make sense and be elegant and effortless.
就是这个是我们连接两个历史性的两个楼之间的一个连接。然后从这个可以看出，我们的设计呢，在不打破它现有的城市的基理的情况下呢，如何设计出一个连续的，然后又优雅的一个设计。
We're interested in these kind of spaces, which are, for me, spaces of simultaneity of communication, where many different levels, different directions, outside and inside, all become intervisible. And you have very deep and layered vistas, and whenever you move, new things come into view. So it becomes a very dynamic and connective space.
就是我对这种的空间特别感兴趣，因为这样这种空间关系加强了你在楼的各个那个地方的沟通。
Because that's the way we need to stay in touch, be connected. That makes sense in what I call a post-fordist network society, where we all need to be communicating and networking all the time. We cannot hide in our little room or walk down a corridor into an elevator, into a cell, and not understand what everybody else is doing. We need to stay in touch and connected in the urban space in all buildings.
这个我管它叫后福特网络主义。然后我们不应该只把自己关在自己的一个小的空间里，而应该看在这个大的空间里，其他人的活动。
This is also a building that shows how we can fit into very, very complex sites with underground parts, overground parts. You can move underneath, over it, all around. It partly becomes landscape and very, very much pliant, fitting into complex conditions while maintaining its own unity.
这个案例也是说，如果我们在这个设计的过程中，在复杂的设计场所里，如何联系周围的关系，然后如何在保持我们设计理念同时的情况下，如何又能与周围的环境相连。
It's also communities between outside and inside. You can live underneath the building. It becomes a connective tissue in the urban environment. But it's very complex in its relationship, but it's visually much calmer and legible than the urban chaos around.
就是它是作为连接城市基理的一个节点，然后我们在那个外观上看呢，又是一个很平静的、很优雅的一个建筑。
This building also looks different from each side, sponsors many different interior spaces, but they all flow into each other, and you always know that you're in this building, and there's certain logics which vary and repeat, but they're not repeat literally. There's a language that makes sense in different situations.
就是这个楼在各个角度我们能看到。它的表现是不一样的，然后它不是简单的重复，它是有逻辑的重复，而且让你在这个楼的各个位置都能知道自己所处的位置是哪里。
Again, it's in a space of communication, of urban intensification we're interested in.
这也是我们想关注的城市间沟通的问题和这个集中的问题。
this is a field space where you have many cells aggregated, and this is driven by environmental criteria, by sun and wind, and again a lot of interior connections, courtyards. So it's and works with a hexagonal cell, but this hexagonal cell varies in size, so it gets a lot of different conditions.
这个是一个单元设计，但是根据这个环境因素啊、风力啊我们的那个每个单元都有变化，中间的那个空间也是变化的。
This is part of an effort to try to adapt to local cultural sensitivities and adopt features and tectonic systems.
这个设计是我们想如何适应地区性的那个文化背景。
And here an attempt to work with multi-story timber structures.
这个我们想尝试用这个木结构。
And this project is again a project which works with cultural references, with the idea of domes and walls, but translated also into very contemporary high-performance concrete shells, very light, and but to create a series of spaces which make sense culturally.
这个也是我们根据这个区域文化做的一个设计，还是用那个盒状结构，然后轻质的水泥盒状结构。
But also then making spaces of simultaneity, spaces of connection and communication.
然后让这个室内空间有这个连续性和波动性。
Finally, some images of the way we conceive of towers. Towers should not be one-way streets with a core which cuts out communication on each floor. Instead, we should have atria and open spaces all the way through the tower to make connections across sections and within each floor. Yeah.
在那个高层建筑中呢，我其实不太喜欢中线合金筒，因为合金筒把这个整个楼的空间每层空间都隔绝起来了。然后我喜欢这种宽阔的中庭，然后这样加强了多动性。
So this kind of project is important to me also to show that we're addressing high density, large complexes with that new repertoire.
所以像这种案例呢，我们就是着重强调高密度、高联系的一种设计理念。
And our attempt to integrate in urban environments. So if you look at this master plan in Singapore, this was an open site with different urban fragments, quite different all around, and an attempt has been made to connect locally and work with topography and conditions.
这是我们到城市规划的角度上，这是我们在新加坡的一个城市规划。我们尝试连接这周围的城市碎片，然后从而实现一个连续统一的一个设计。
And instead of having a condition where you have 100 equal blocks, you create a condition where variation is the principle, and then you have a whole range of blocks, but they're not randomly scattered, but they're aligned according to certain gradients and flow lines, which make sense with the topography, with the surrounding fabric. So you get variation, and you get adaptive affiliation, and therefore the potential of navigating a rule-based environment.
就是与这个所有的那个楼的形态都是一样的所不同。我们想强调的是城市记忆的连续性，所以我们每个楼的那个大小都不一样，然后但是它们的那个形态关系又有逻辑性。
So what we've created means that pragmatism is to some extent real, but I think it's only a drop in the ocean in the overall context of what's going on.
我认为三元化主义是可行的，但是在现在的那个设计大环境下，还是 不是影响力还不是很大。
So for us, this work is a kind of proof of concept. We can work on all regions, continents, on all scales, across all function types.
就是我们可以把参数化主义应用到所有的地域、所有的尺度和所有功能的设计上。
So now we'll become a little more theoretical for a moment.
我们现在开始强调一下这个理论。
And I want to say that the city is a gigantic ordering or sorting machine, so we need to think of it not just giving accommodation, shelter, and a place, but we need to think of that these places and situations are ordered so that they can recognize, find each other, and look at that social structuration problem as the primary problem for the built environment.
就是我们城市是巨大社会演变排序机器，然后我们设计的主要想解决的问题是城市的秩序性。
So I'm saying we should therefore also, as architects and the disciplines and the leaders of the disciplines, should shift attention to this problem, which now becomes our core competency of ordering the built environment in ways that also communicate this order to the participants, because that makes social cooperation and the life process possible.
所以我们应该把关注点放在如何加强城市的秩序，然后如何让这个我们现有的城市秩序更加适应我们现处的社会体系。
And we need to look at that historically, because contemporary society is very different from the society of 50 years ago. So we need to continuously adapt the spatial logics we're providing to the social logics and social processes.
就是从历史的角度上看，我们现在所处的社会呢，变化性很快，然后我们想推出一种设计，它能适应我们现在的那个社会体系变化的节奏。
So rather than saying architecture gives containers and shelter, we need to look at architecture delivering some kind of game board, a matrix which structures interaction.
就是建筑不应该是仅仅遮风挡雨的一个场所，而是如何能加强各种功能关系的一个。
So you look at the built environment as a set of instructions, a text nearly written onto the landscape which tells us what is where, who we are, and orders rules of interaction.
就是我们要加强可读性和这个我们对这个空间的我们所处空间位置的关系。
So I'm looking at it like a sports field, where these lines indicate when you cross that line, new rules of interaction are relevant. When you cross this line, yet another set of rules apply. There are certain territories demarcated, also the audience is cut off. There's different costumes, the tricots, uniforms, the referees. So through spatial distinctions, and there don't need to be walls, it could just be lines, plus the fashion system, plus other objects which structure interaction. That is what architecture and design is all about. And what it delivers is the creation of society. That means an ordered interaction process, cooperation process, which delivers the prosperity which we are achieving.
就是根据场上的这些关系，比如说场上的那个白线和队员队服，我们可以读出他们在这场比赛中的他们在这个比赛中的地位和这个秩序。所以我觉得在建筑中，我们作为建筑师应该实现的也是这种建筑在城市中的可实性、可实践性。
So if you look at this and you remember the park and ride scheme with the car park and tram station, that graphic approach to architecture was to understand what to do where, one has to first be able to read the structure, and then everybody behaves according to that structure.
然后我们想把这种图形上的识别性应用到建筑设计当中去。
Otherwise, no ordered interaction is possible, and society stops.
如果我们不把它运用中去的话，我们无法实现这个社会空间秩序，然后我们的那个社会秩序就会停止。
So animals don't have that built environment, so they're left to roam around naked in the wild, and that's why they stay the same for millions of years.
这个动物跟人类的区别就是它们没有社会地位，所以它们在这个进化中一直保持不变。
And what I think is that we are, as humans, we managed to create an artificial environment, and we started to design the surrounding and ourselves to build up a social order.
就是我们人类跟那个动物界的区别，就是我们尝试着通过空间秩序来实现这个社会秩序。
And this is a big effort for very, very poor and poverty-stricken groups. There's a lot of investment, time and energy in these differentiating decorations, so there must be absolutely essential life necessities. And that's why there's no society which does not invest in
就比如说这个图片里
this.
这个部落，他们花了很多精力在他们的服饰和装饰上，然后这个也是个例子，说明了没有任何一个社会体系不是不花精力在如何区分社会秩序上。
So through a built environment, through defining groups and a social division in status groups within groups, you can build up a larger structure with larger numbers interacting in ordered ways.
这个通过社会分工和各种不同的组合，我们可以实现这个有关联的、有交流的一种秩序。
So you can lay out activities, you can distinguish groups and subgroups, rights of access, and therefore build up a social organism.
然后你可以识别这个场所内的活动，然后也可以识别这个空间上的区分。
And this decorative graphic overlay, which all humans put onto themselves, even today, is also a necessary substrate for embedding more information into the built environment through ornamentation. So ornament is also a life necessity.
就是符号学上讲，这个装饰性也是我们社会秩序不可缺的元素。
So we need to understand this as an information system, as a language, or a semi-logical system.
我们应该把它看作是一种有辨识度的符号学的一个系统。
So human society is structured through the places and distinctions in space, as well as the dress codes, etc. That generates human society.
人类社会的秩序是通过空间和不同服饰以及这个区域活动所联系的。
So here you can see it also. It's everywhere in the world you find subtle spatial thresholds, steps, lines, signals and symbols which stabilize social order.
就是在各个文化，你都可以看到这种微妙的符号的关系，然后从而通过这种符号上的关系来加强空间秩序。
And that's the way we need to start looking at the built environment in history, but also in the contemporary.
所以我们想，不仅在历史上看到这种关系，也想把它应用到我们现在的那个设计当中去。
It's obvious in a structure like the palace, which represents, in a sense, the government structure of the empire.
就是像这种非常有结构的一种设计，是凸显了这个王宫的一种设计。
But it's the totality of the built environment is such a structure and text.
很有结构感，然后也很有这个功能性。
So if you look at it like a chessboard, you can only play game of chess if you have a chessboard, and if you have different characters, you get a more complex game.
就像下象棋一样，就是我们只有有棋盘才可以开始我们的游戏，然后我们又给不同的棋子以不同的角色。
So this becomes like a metaphor, analogy to what designers can do to a social process.
这个与我们作为设计者在社会进程中的作用相似。
And there could be many different versions of it, so there's a lot of degrees of freedom because it's a system of distinctions, which is important.
就是我们也可以设计出不同的棋盘，然后增加那个设计的自由度。
So, but this is also representing some kind of interaction scenario of a lunch or dinner or breakfast.
这个餐桌呢，也是表现这种交流关系的一个。
But for me, it's also an indication when things become complex, we could quickly become disorienting. If a designer does not structure it through geometry, through color, through form, through a network of similitudes and contrasts, making what belongs together similar, expressing difference and relationships. That's what design should be doing, and our urban environment collapses and falls apart if there's no systematicity in structuring that urban text.
就是随着我们的这个物品的复杂性的增多，使这个设计者越来使这个桌面上的物品的可识别度越来越低。所以我们作为设计者，我们应该想办法如何通过颜色或者通过记忆把这些物品组合起来。
So this becomes a problem of a compositional task to make that viable.
这个就变成了一个如何使这个物品有机组合起来的一个问题。
So, and to make that compositional task make us more intelligent about this compositional task, to give us some scientific resources. I've been looking at the psychology of perception to understand how our perceptual processes would group and order and read figures within a complex constellation.
就是我用格式塔组织原则来尝试如何解决这个各种物品的组织问题。
So we're trying to read figures. Maybe you can draw a figure of a square around these four corners. So this is the way we look at things. We order, or we start aligning the plate with the chair, and we know that there are four persons. So we're making connections, and that is an act of subjective synthesis.
我们可以尝试连接这4个盘子，然后之后，因为我们在空间上又放了4把椅子，这样的话，通过这种简单的形式，我们就可以有效的读出这个物品的排列方式。
So if you look at this, you might agree that you're seeing 4 lines. But of course, these lines are not really there. This is the way we mentally process an image like that.
就是看右边那个图，我们可以 可以读出这是4条线，但是其实这4条线并不存在。
And here we're seeing 4 horizontal lines, and here we're seeing again horizontal lines, because in this case similarity trumps proximity. So although these circles are closer together here, we are looking at connecting similar circles into lines.
就是从左边这张图上，我们就可以看出我们的相似性已经胜过于相近性，所以我们能读出4条横线。
But you cannot, you could also see vertical lines. It's just that similarity would guide us into the horizontal. So there are certain automatic biases, the way the majority of perceivers would decompose the overall scene into lines.
当然，你也可以读出竖直的竖线，但是因为我们的相似性的因素呢，使这个横线可实性更高。
So the way to look at this is here is, if you look at this figure, it decomposes into 2 continuous lines. So if you look at this, you see line A and line B crossing each other.
就是如果把这个现在看我们的那个图形，可以把读成是2条曲线，然后让它们相交在一起。
Because usually we privilege smooth continuation, and this would be unusual. This would be possible but unusual to see 2 beacons meeting each other.
就是因为我们视觉优先性呢是想优先阅读优先识别连续性，所以我们很难看出它是两个角组织在一起。
So we're privileging smooth continuation. We also if you have a built environment that is very simplistic, like the city is a walled circle. You know when you're in the city, outside the city, you can look at it from the outside. It's an easy understood entity. You move into the center, you find 3 simple buildings. We don't have to make much of a theory about how to perceive a complex world because the world is simple.
就是在这个历史上的城市是由围墙围起来的一个空间，然后所以我们并不需要应用这些符号学或者是对称符号学或者是图形学来阅读来识别我们在城市的那个所处的环境，因为它的复杂度不是很高。
But the contemporary built environment and the contemporary society doesn't allow itself to be represented and housed and accommodated with such simplistic figures.
但是我们现在所处的居住环境并不是由这么简单的图形所构成的。
So already modernism needed more degrees of freedom to build up a more complex set of spaces and institutions.
就是从现代主义开始呢，他们已经开始尝试如何增加我们设计中的自由度，然后来实现更复杂的空间。
This is the Bauhaus building in Dessau from the mid-1920s, and you can see that modernism has more versatility, degrees of freedom. It doesn't constrain itself anymore with symmetry, and it doesn't constrain itself with simple proportions. It can stretch and add in all directions.
这个是1920年左右的那个包豪斯的设计。从这个设计中，你可以看出来，他们已经打破了对称性，然后如何使这个建筑连续，然后实现这个建筑的更有活力。
So it is a freedom to have different depths of building, different facades, and combine the elements of a complex institution. This is the apartment building, and it has different facades, the workshop building, the administrative building, the classrooms. But the problem starts, you don't know actually what belongs together. There's the risk of this institution visually to fall apart, and it gets confused with additional buildings around, so you don't actually see the Bauhaus, it disappears.
但是这个设计的问题就是说，在这个您看不到这个设计跟其他东西的关系，所以这个设计如果把它放到城市 中去呢，它会消失。
So this is again, it becomes rich and complex, but the unity of the institution, which is also a unity of interaction, where elements work together, and we should recognize what belongs together and works together, that becomes visually precarious or is at risk. It disintegrates visually.
就是它在视觉上呢，就会分散开去。
And just one moment in terms of compositional theory. So I'm not saying we have to go back to a simple closed form with symmetry and proportion, because we cannot make a complex institution like this. Life is too complex to fit back into a classical form. Now we have to let it grow and be complex. What can we do to nevertheless allow us to orient within this complexity?
就是回到组合关系上去，我认为我们不应该回到这个方格子状的设计中去。因为我们现在所处的这个设计环境要求我们有更复杂的设计，然后我们需要解决的问题就是如何在更复杂的这个环境下，让我们的建筑更有连续性。
So I just want to point out in terms of compositional theory, although there's no symmetry, there's no proportion, there is no similarity between all the parts in terms of decoration, etc. What the modernist composition institutional building often has is a dynamic equilibrium composition, so it tries to balance an overall figure around the center of gravity, so it gives you a sense of unity and what belongs together.
就是现代主义尝试呢，平衡各个区域间的关系，然后给你在视觉上知道这个给你在视觉上知道这个建筑的提升建筑的主体感和它中心位置在哪里。
So in modern composition, you're quite free to compose elements, much different, a totally different practice and game from a classical, where you just fit things into the preconceived. You have the freedom to compose, but there is this more intuitive rule of dynamic equilibrium. And I say this to in this context, that's something you learn about compositional theory. I always think about what it delivers for the functionality, the recognizability, for instance, of a unity. So also compositional theory is in the end linked to social functionality.
就是现代主义已经尝试发展着如何通过组织各种不同的空间，然后来实现这个平衡协调性。这就与我们之前说的这个方格子限制的设计方法不同。
So if we had starting to have a problem here, we have a huge problem here, right? There is no legibility, no order, no structure, no predictability of the decomposition.
就是现在我们城市的现状，就是我们完全没有可视性。
That's the condition of total disarticulation of the amorphous, and a lot of people find that menacing and disorienting, and we react to this also intuitively and find it terribly ugly, which means we are repulsed, we're pulling away from this.
然后我们很容易在城市中失去方向感，失去识别度，然后我们认为这样的城市设计是丑陋的。
This is one reaction. At the same time, we know and feel that we have to be there because that's where life goes on. That's where the urban vitality pulls us in. So we feel a necessity, and I think there is the objective necessity to move and agglomerate in global centers. But there's this kind of problem of visual chaos.
当然，我们又知道，因为城市中心是所有这个城市活力的这个聚合点，所以我们又想生活在城市中心。但是我们也知道城市中心这个混乱程度。
So I just want to rehearse a little bit how you start with a small community structure, and there is through history a series of expansions of the built environment from small communities to larger groups, to city-states, to countries, and architectural styles track this historical process.
就是我们现在想回顾一下，我们城市演变如何是从小的城市，小的这个村落到城市这个发展的过程。
Also want to point out that these arrangements are nearly natural. If you enclose a village, the circle is the most economical form. So it's not something you invent, you discover. If you want to make a village wall which is very long, this is uneconomical and vulnerable. So there is a kind of natural process of nearly like a cell separating itself in a medium. So the human built environment evolution can be analyzed very similar to a natural formation of organic life.
就是村庄的形成呢，其实是很自然而然的，它自然而然就是形成了一个以中间为聚集的一个环形形状，然后这就说明我们在城市演变的过程中也是适应着一定自然规律，有机自然规律。
So you start with one circle, and then how do you grow that circle? It's very natural to build rings out. So you can see that the form is not something invented and planned. It is nearly a necessary crystallization of the constraints and conditions of life, of social life.
就是从第一层圆环，我们如何建到第二层的时候，就很自然而然的想到我们在外层再建一层圆环。
So and that's very important that because for me this is the evolution of society goes hand in hand with the evolution of the built environment, and the built environment is the material cross-generationally stable substrate of evolution because you can accrue and accumulate and build up structure cumulatively across centuries, also through a trial and error process, and that is absolutely necessary for social evolution and cultural evolution to happen. You need a material substrate, like the DNA for biological evolution. That's the built environment for cultural evolution.
就是我们城市的演变应该跟社会的演变相结合，然后同时在这个材料跟这个构造方法上有一定的突破。
So you need to fix and stabilize the evolutionary achievements because you can fix them with the built environment. But the primates, the apes, the animals who are just a flock always naked, they cannot evolve at all because they have nothing to accumulate and build up the structure.
社会演变是一个这个积累的过程，这也就是说，这也解释了为什么在动物世界里，它们演变很缓慢。
So they always have to start from scratch. They're always going around in circles.
所以这就是为什么他们一直在原地转圈，因为他们没有积累的这个过程。
So you can build up and have a single center, then there's a second center. This becomes a marketplace, a church, and then when you these things can then be copied and repeated, and they can keep growing also.
就是你可以有多个城市中心，然后之后由这些城市中心出发，然后可以开始这个城市的演变过程。
And this is always the same diagram in a particular culture. Thousands of cities around Europe are exactly the same formula.
就是在这个欧洲所有的城市大概都按照这个相同的形式。
At a certain point, nobody has planned and designed these. There's a moment when architecture emerges and we are starting to draw and seemingly design cities, but you can see that the design city, the ideal city, is nothing but a geometric rationalization of the evolved city.
就是我们有建筑师设计的、有建筑师规划的这个城市，跟这个涌现跟这个历史上涌现出来这个小城市相比呢，并没有很大区别，只不过是我们更加强调了这个几何上的可识别性。
But now development can accelerate very fast because you can draw one version, but then you can also expand and then start inventing and use, instead of evolving a city across centuries in real construction, you can involve ideas and versions of the city on paper much faster.
就是因为我们现在通过规划呢，我们可以加速这个预判演变这个过程。
So that for me is the origin of architecture, where you move from unconscious tradition-bound building, where you just repeat what has always been done, into a mode where you speculate on paper and start discussing the advantages and disadvantages of particular city layouts.
这就是我认为城市规划者应该实现的，就是从没有意识的这个演变到在纸上如何通过讨论各种不同的变化性、优势和劣势来设计一个城市的这个格局。
And of course, as you know, the Renaissance is the first time that these cities and buildings are fully designed, that you have named architects, and that you have texts and discussions and theories of architecture. So architecture is based on architects, architectural theory, and architectural designs. And everything up to then is not really architecture.
就是从文艺复兴开始呢，我们才有建筑师这个概念。然后建筑，我认为是
architects, theory and drawings.
是那个建筑图纸跟那个设计和这个建筑师所构成的。
So you can see that the history and societal development accelerates once we have speculation, not trial and error in the real world, where we have no speculation and trial and error on drawings and texts.
就是我们通过这个在设计过程中的尝试呢，可以加速城市演变过程。
And I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but this is Brasilia, and this is a fully planned and designed city, maybe the last beautiful urban environment which was constructed and created in the 1960s.
巴西利亚是一个1960年代全面规划的一个城市，然后我认为这是一个最后一个充满美感的城市。
I mean, there's a clearly planned order with the government institutions, ministries, residential complexes, a rhythm of retail spaces. It's all clearly pre-ordered.
就是各种城市功能性建筑都有一定的秩序关系。
And a very beautiful, elegant, easy to orient environment.
然后在城市中也很容易找到方向。
But it's far too simplistic for the contemporary life.
但是对我们现在的这个生活来讲，太过于简单。
This city makes only sense in a world where there's a mechanical mass production of a few items for millions of people, where everybody gets the same house, a car, the same food, cornflakes on the table, similar jobs, 9 to 5 in the cornflakes factory. Maybe you have electricity, hot water, TV, but there's universal standards, mechanically mass reproduced, and then you can lay out the different parts of that society very easy. There's a lot of separation, repetition, and the specialization of the different parts of the city. So the city diagram could look like this.
这种设计呢，只适合于这个简单重复性高的一种社会结构。
So this is Le Corbusier's city for 3 million inhabitants, where you have the business district, the residential district, logistics, retail and such, and then the industrial district.
就是这个客户的规划，上面有商业空间，然后 居住空间，然后城市管理空间。
This doesn't have a wall. This could expand in all directions, but it's very clearly zoned. Life is very simple. People have a job for life. They do the same thing their whole life for decades. The same factory, the same cornflakes, the same car, etc. So that is possible. That was Fordism. That was the society of modernism.
这个就是现代主义时期的这个城市生活。你每个通过这种组合呢，这个生活状态会特别重复和单一。这就是福特主义下的生活状态。
So this relatively simple industrial structure and was compatible with central planning. I think it was also compatible with communism.
这个就是很适合社会主义的一种城市规划。
Because if you have an industrial process which can produces cheaply millions of things, everybody more or less has the same.
就是因为在这种城市规划下，我们每个人所拥有的东西都是几乎相同的。
And this process is not able to create variety, and there's no point if there's only one type or two types of car. There's no point to be rich to have 5 cars or have 10 packets of cornflakes in the morning. It makes no sense.
这种规划只适合于特别简单的一个重复性高的一个生活方式。
Everybody is the same. Because if you have a prefabrication factory which can be millions of houses, then this is the way prosperity is generated, but that makes everybody equal, merely by physical necessity of the production process.
对，在这种条件下，就是所有东西都是相同的。
But it also makes life very, very simplistic.
就是生活特别简单。
And these were the kind of city plans, endless repetition. And different zones, residential zones, business districts, separated out.
就是这种分离城市功能性的一种城市规划，然后也是重复性特别高。
But society evolved to the next level, and there was capacities of differentiating products, innovating, of creating variety, and this dynamism of fast innovation cycles allowed a new level of sophistication in life, which made this old built environment irrelevant. It was great for 50 years, but it would not have been the right environment for the coming 15 years.
就是通过社会的演变，我们对这个社会功能性要求越来越高，然后这种单一重复性高的设计只适用于50年前，但并不适应我们现在所处的这个社会生活节奏。
So the architecture of modernism was well adapted to that idea of separating zones, specializing them, then endless repetition in 3 or 4 or 5 zones. And since everybody was the same, there was no need to differentiate. Now we're looking at this kind of urban agglomeration with a lot of diverse institutions, multiple audience, multiple cultures, multiple income groups, multiple professions, in continuous dynamic networking exchange, not doing the same thing for 30 years, but doing something new and different nearly every month or every year.
就是我们从现代主义到我们现在所处的生活环境，我们的这个生活方式不是简单重复的，而是多样性更高的、更有活力的一个生活方式。
So this new dynamism could only be delivered through a much more decentralized open market process. This new complexity cannot be planned from the top down, neither with the economy nor with the built environment. That's why we had a revolution in the so-called neoliberal revolution, and we had the shift from Fordism to post-Fordism, and an unleashing of market processes, which made the new stage of prosperity possible.
就是这种我们现在所处的这个社会环境，从新自由主义到福特主义到后福特网络社会，然后我们需要的一种以及我们现在的城市规划不应该是从上而下，而是需要一种从下而上的一种多作者的一种城市规划。
So, our intuition has been that that new level of complexity can be given form and shape and order, but it will not be the order of simple boxes, circles, rectangles, triangles, which now just accumulate like a huge mass, but there needs to be other ways of creating an intricate urban order.
我们尝试给社会的秩序是不仅仅是从基本几何图形的随机排列组合，而是希望给这个通过有机变化的这个形态，然后给社会一种新的秩序。
So we can't just stay with these simple figures and just pile them together.
我们不能只是把这些基本图形把它们随机的放到一起。
If you do that, then nonsense comes out.
因为这样的话就是没有任何意义。
So these are the kind of cities which have evolved in the last 30 years. They are amorphous, sprawling collages.
这就是过去30年中形成的城市，它们就是简单变形的这种拼接。
And I don't think that has happened all over the world. You don't know where you are anymore. You don't know where you are within the city. You don't know which continent you are, if you like, if you confront such environments.
这也就是一种全球化的现象，你并不能知道你所处的在哪个城市。
Sometimes there is maybe an icon which gives you a bit of a clue where you are.
这个有时候有一些地标性建筑能给你一些信息，让你知道在哪里。
But a single icon can only do so much to give orientation. And if you pile many of them together, they cancel each other out.
但是这个地标性建筑不能在整体上给城市方向感。
So it's not the icon which we can rely on.
所以我们不能依靠地标性建筑增加城市的可视性。
So this is incredibly disorienting, right? You don't know where you are and where you're going, and you don't know what to expect next. What you have in view doesn't tell you what will come into view. There could be any random confrontation, and there's no law and rule about how to find things in this.
所以在这种混乱的城市中，你没有任何法则或者是规范来指引你在城市中的方向。
Sometimes again, an icon, this is Sao Paulo, but it doesn't help here anymore.
地标性建筑的影响力是只是区域性的。
It also only helps locally.
所以其实我们的设计也是仅仅在区域上提高了这个可视性。
So, what I believe is that if we move away from modernism or a kind of degenerate modernism where you have modern architecture but no longer any modern urbanism, we have a condition where we have modern architecture and no urbanism at the moment. We have to switch into parametric architecture and parametric urbanism.
就是因为我们现在并不是所处于现代主义，所以我们现代主义的设计呢，并不能适应我们现在的城市秩序，所以只有参人化主义才能让我们才能适应我们所处的这个市场秩序。
But first of all, we have to also realize that the planning process is hopelessly impotent, and if you look at these conditions, even though there are planners at work, obviously nobody wanted this, nobody has planned this. So this is an outcome which is part of a spontaneous market urbanization process, and the planners can do nothing positive, but they can do a lot of negative.
就是说，我们现在这个自上而下城市规划越来越失去它的意义。我们能为城市，我们城市规划者能为城市创造的正面价值越来越少。
Because they make arbitrary decisions: where is residential, where is offices, how high, how dense, where is retail, prescribing standards for units, etc., etc. So they do a lot of economic damage and prevent entrepreneurial creativity to develop the intricacy of connections and synergies, maybe between residential, retail, offices. That needs to be opened up. At the same time, you can see that on the visual level, they are not achieving anything.
因为城市规划者在这个城市功能性决定城市功能性的过程中是很随机的，他们并没有适应这个市场或者是商业的要求，然后所以即使是在视觉上，我们也能看出来它的混乱程度特别高。
The planners don't know where should be what; they have no clue.
因为这个规划者并不知道这个城市的功能性在哪里。
And they don't get the profit and loss, the client signal in a trial and error process, which the market has, through trial and error, through profit and loss, to find out and discover the intricate connections and textures and requirements. That's why I'm very much in favor of radicalizing market forces within the development process, the urban development process.
就是我们现在这个规划的过程应该越来越借助市场的作用，然后让这个让这个市场的这个注意来决定。
I'm in favor of this. I think it's inevitable, even though it delivers that visual chaos I'm criticizing. But I think that we can maintain market processes and overcome the visual chaos.
我们应该这个保留市场在城市规划中的作用，然后来这个除去视觉上混乱的这个障碍。
So we need to have the freedom of entrepreneurs and the architects to generate creative solutions, to build up the synergies and bottom up order, social order and economic order of the city.
所以我们应该从这个自上而下这个规划，转到自下而上的这个由市场决定的一个规划过程。
So we're looking at bottom up order versus a top down order.
我们现在研究的是自上而下秩序和自上而下秩序的这个关系。
And I believe that even though we have visual chaos, what we have underneath is actually an integral programmatic order where things are finding each other, where things are connected, because entrepreneurs establish their enterprises and developers establish, but of course only to the limits of planners giving them, and these limits have to go away. But we could assume that the market process delivers a degree of programmatic order, but this programmatic order is not articulate, it remains invisible, and therefore doesn't function as fully as it could function.
就是我们这个以市场为基础的这个城市发展过程，可以实现这个多种的功能性的这种错综的关系，然后并且让这种功能性的关系，增加这种功能性关系的视觉化程度。
So if there is market freedom, you can expect that all these things make sense relative to each other, that things come close to each other, that this line collects things which are of importance, a secondary line have things which don't need less connection. So the market process will sort things relative to each other into some kind of high performance structure.
这个市场能将这个城市各种功能排序，然后从而实现一种这个高表现能力的一种城市功能关系。
Because entrepreneurs can discover opportunities and then they get imitated, and if you have a bottom-up process, the problem is that on the visual scale, this really collapses into disarticulation.
就是在视觉上，它的城市跟现在这个垃圾是有相似之处，因为它们没有任何视觉上的连接。
So that's why I'm talking about garbage store urbanization.
所以管这个叫这个垃圾堆城市。
And you see the paradox is that each garbage can contains very specific and individual things, very different things in each household, and many different things you would want to distinguish. But once they're all spilled together, you have sameness, you see nothing. You can find nothing. It's all there, but you cannot find it and see nothing.
就是把这些垃圾放到一起的话，我们根本识别不出来它其中的关系。
And you can say, well, I use GPS and I search the web, but that's a very small interface, and there's only one information at a time. But I'm talking about the environment, 360-degree in layers. That gives me information. That has far bigger bandwidth than this. I have this anyway. So, for me that is not a substitute to say we rely on this to find these spots in the spill. This is only a few points I need to also preconceive and then type it and then find it. What I need to do, I need to browse the built environment, and according to laws and logics, I need to have the super bandwidth of the built environment available for me to make the good moves, connections I need to make to become more productive and enhance my life.
就是即使我们现在有这个导航工具，但是我也希望这个从这个大尺度上能识别出城市机理，然后之后让这个城市的关联提升城市的关联性。
But still, I would say this chaos, this is still better than Brasilia. Much better. Brasilia is too sterile, too monotonous. Things are spaced apart. We want to be connected to many things. The problem is if I'm here, I don't know even that there's something which I need here. But it's still far better than Brasilia.
但是基于这种垃圾式的这个城市规划，也是比这个巴西利亚的城市规划要好一些，因为因为我们这个城市的功能性更高一些。
That's why architects realize that we have to like this. We have to aestheticize this. We have to build a language which matches this condition. And that's to some extent deconstructivism. Or a drawing like this, you could read it as the aesthetization of wanting to make the ugly beautiful, revaluing the values, and rejecting the simplicity of Brasilia and developing a lust for complexity.
所以这个就是解构主义尝试的想把这个丑陋的这个排列美观化。
And to create such urbanism not as an accident, but as a desire of collaging and layering and intensifying.
所以就是有这种在规划过程中，就是把这个随机的拼接和这个分层次叠加在一起。
But this has still the problem. It's the same problem as this. It's better than Brasilia, but it's still menacing and disorienting.
当然，这个也存在着这个导向性和这个连接性的问题。
And what I noticed is, well, you can say, if you look at a city like London or Shanghai or other cities, the only thing which gives orientation, order, structure are the natural element like rivers, mountains.
就是能提升城市辨识度的只有这个河流和就是这些自然因素。
If you didn't have the River Thames, you would be far more worse off in London. You could totally disoriented.
如果没有泰晤士河的话，在伦敦很难找到方向。
But you see, it is not a simple line. It is a pulsing, a varied line, a complex line. Yet it has order and rhythm.
但是这个不是简单的一条线，这是一个有韵律感的一条线。
It has a gradient. It flows in one direction, becomes wider. It has a structure one could use as a navigation device.
它有渐变性，还有尺度的变化性，所以我们可以把它作为导航性的一个工具。
So we're looking at natural systems like rivers and river ramifications, maybe more complex than the channeled rivers of our cities, to deliver a complex variegated order.
所以我们尝试着用借助这个自然的这些图形来实现这个复杂的社会秩序。
So we're looking at systems like this, fluid dynamics. We're looking at maybe swarms that could be very complex. They could be three-dimensional instead of having a random spill where all the different small, medium, large are scattered. We're having an ordered swarm condition. So we're maintaining complexity and differentiation, but we're regaining order.
通过有逻辑的这个连接这个不同的节点，然后我们想实现一种有关联性的一个城市规划设计。
And such urban escapes, and this is just only one subsystem of fabric. The fabric varies from tower to small, medium, large, broad, small. There's directionality. There's a lot of things going on here, and these are delivered by rules, by scripts, which is important because you can then infer back. There's a regularity, predictability, yet a lot of versatility in such a process.
就是通过算法和规律形成的这种城市规划，更有逻辑，然后也为城市功能性提高更强的活力感。
So we can look at a lot of natural formations, and we look at rules and building up complex variegated orders as a paradigm and way of working.
就是我们想尝试通过这个自然和这个算法两者相结合，然后实现一种新的这个设计模式。
So you can see the variations there in terms of direction, size, networking, color. So this is just a representation of how we can start to approach the problem.
这是我们实现如何解决问题的一个这个方法。
So you have all the variation, but it's in a particular order structure.
所以各种变化都是存在于一个有秩序的一个结构中。
And we've done that for a number of years under the label of thematic urbanism in DRL and in other research arenas, and we've done some master planners and architects also. And we're looking for this variety, complexity, richness, and maintaining a sense of organic order.
就是我们在这个 DRL 和这个事务所中应用这种算法来实现复杂性高，然后多样性多的一种设计方法。
But there is still a challenge and a problem in these kind of projects because they are far too simple and they are single author projects. They're still master planning projects.
但这种解决问题的方法还是有一些问题，因为它其实还是只有单一作者的一个规划过程。
So they still point in the right direction, but they pose a dilemma. How can the market deliver something like this? Does this not require a strong planning overlay, and does that not become unrealistic in the contemporary condition?
就是如何通过现在我们社会所处的情况，如何解决这种单一性的这个设计问题？
And that's why I have another take on this. So for me, these projects are only half of the solution. They're just an indication and can't be the real solution.
所以这个只是一半解决问题的方法，然后他们只是一个这个解决问题的一个方向。
So these are Zalid Architects projects. This is students of mine in DRL. They're single author master planning projects. Of course, they have the intricacy, the complexity, the variation. But how does this sacked with the unpredictability and open-ended market process? That was my question. So, yeah.
如何让单一作者这种城市规划来适应我们当今的这个市场经济？
So we can take this literal as master plans, but there are simulations of something which could happen in a spontaneous market order.
我们不能只把这个单一作者这个作为解决方案，但是我们可以模拟一种这个设计方式来更加适应我们市场的进化过程。
So what we started to experiment with is having different teams, different authors, different architects working individually, but co-evolving and adapting with each other without central plan. And that's, for instance, the project we tried on the coast of Istanbul, where there are several different projects which touch and bleed into each other, but they started individually. And if all the different authors have worked with the same paradigm, a set of principles, and the ethos of trying to connect, to affiliate, to assimilate, to resonate, to communicate, even though they're very different projects, they can adapt to each other, embed within each other, grow over each other, but there needs to be that ethos of wanting to also pick up ideas and radiate them across in new and creative ways. So I think there could be a project which is a evolving urban texture with many authors, always unpredictable, always unplanned, but in the end deliver an organic unity, or coherence. Yeah.
通过这个多作者的一个设计方式，然后只要这个我们多作者用同样一个设计模式，我们可以实现一个联系度高的一个空间支持高的一个这个城市规划的一个环境。
Just looking at more models of nature, but if you look at natural environments, I started to look at these kind of environments, which I call multi-species ecologies.
我关注于这样的自然环境，我管叫这个多物种的这个组合环境。
So you have multiple independent subsystems. You have the formation of mountains, the erosion of rivers, the flow of water. You have rules, and these are all rule-based interactions. You have the fauna growing and differentiating according to condition, and then the fauna, the animals settling in independently. Of course, there is no central plan at all, but there is an adaptive capacity in each of these systems, and the rule-based speciation and nesting of one system onto another.
就是在一个主系统下，我们有不同的次系统，然后这种次系统通过之间的相互关系，功能性的关系，然后我们从而能实现一个这个连续性高的一个这样的一个体系。
So these are multiple scripts overlaying each other or one next to the other, if you like, and that becomes the analogy I want to work with, creating a complex, variegated, organic order without master plan, based on the fact that all designers, all architects would work with these kind of repertoires and tools, and with the intention of participating in an evolving order which is not predicted and pre-planned, but which piece by piece is allowed to evolve, because each and every intervention is making connections, accentuating given underlying structures, continuing gestures and trajectories which are laid out in the service of each institution which wants to articulate its connections and accentuate its role in an overall texture.
就是通过这个多算法叠加的方法，然后从而实现这个多作者规划的这种自下而上的这个城市规划过程，来实现高强度的城市连续性。
So you can imagine that each of these pieces is designed by a different architect for a different client, And if somebody starts doing this kind of roof, and somebody else creates a horizontal, and the ethos would be, and we would expect of each other in the discipline and criticize each other as colleagues if we're not finding a way to interconnect, to make resonances, to mirror, for instance, this solid in this void, or these could be continuing the same pattern by new means. If we have the ethos of continuation, each time it's a creative act, unpredictable, could be left to the new architect. There don't need to be central plan, there needs to be a sense of a unified purpose, agenda, methodology, and a series of, let's say, critical values through which we, as a discourse, laudate and criticize each other.
就是我们想实现这个多作者设计过程中的连续性和流畅性，然后也作为我们如何推动和互相指正设计的一个过程。
So each of these are different projects, yet they generate an overall condition which is lawful, rule-based, and legible. I think that's very important. If
就即使这个是多作者的一个设计，但是通过相似的这个设计规律，我们也能实现一种连续性高的一个。
Like in these natural environments, this is just an analogy. We're talking about a high-density urban order, but each species, each intervention is independently but strongly connected according to the principles of organic life.
就是在这个自然环境中，每个物种虽然它是独立的物种，但是它也是跟其他的次系统相关联的。
It's all rule-based. There's nothing arbitrary.
这个都是有秩序和规则的，没有随机分布的。
But of course, if you randomly interact, if you throw garbage at this, then you disrupt the intricate order of connection and resonance.
如果你随机的这个打乱这个秩序的话，你就失去了这个秩序的这个流畅性。
So this becomes a kind of urban model where we're scripting that, and there could be a lot of variety of projects and sub-projects. But if they're laid down according to the rule, you can infer back what has driven that rule and find that driver, and the driver and driven connect and are inferred from each other.
就是通过算法设计，我们可以知道这个什么是导向性因素，然后这个导向性因素如何影响我们最后城市规划结果。
And there could be a lot of density and three-dimensional complexity in this. That doesn't deter or hamper orientation and unity.
然后这个三维上的这个复杂程度并不能影响这个整体设计的这个整体性。
So I can't show you this in the urban reality or in a large project. This is just an analogy and a speculative theoretical proposition.
这个只是一个宏观上这个理论上的一个这个立场。
Of course, it only can come together if the discipline as a whole converges towards a paradigm, and this paradigm.
这个实现这个设计模式的这个唯一途径，就是所有这个设计者个体向这个设计模式所聚拢。
And this paradigm, even if I say everybody is buying into this paradigm, has so much open-ended creative challenges and potential that within this one style there's going to be so much more diversity and open-endedness compared to all previous styles put together. So there's far more creative openness and unpredictable creative individuality possible while subscribing to a set of global principles.
就是这种设计模式，会增加这个设计的多样性和这个复杂程 个之前所有的设计形式相比，这个是最优先的。
Like the endless form of nature, they're all part of organic life, having fundamental principles of morphogenesis. At the same time, they're incredibly diverse and rich, and they start to connect with each other. They're never randomly and arbitrarily thrown together in nature.
实际上，在自然环境中，我们物种也有很多的这个多样性跟复杂程度，但是它们都是有秩序的、有机的联合在一起。
And one more, maybe the last word I want to say, the discipline at the moment is fragmented into very, very different groups and styles and ways of working. And that obviously can only generate that disarticulate collage.
我们现在学科的这个分散程度太高，所以这导致了我们现在这个简单的这个拼接画一样的这个设计。
If you place a David Chipperfield project next to our project and next to a neo-historical project, next to a neo-vernacular, very quickly you generate garbage, even if each of these projects is beautiful.
就是你把这个多作者，你把这个各个建筑师所设计的东西放到一起，你马上就是增加了这个混乱程度。即使每个单一的设计都是有一定的影响。
So that pluralism, that's the wrong kind of freedom. We need to converge to a shared paradigm within which we have enormous freedoms.
所以这个多设计模式其实是一种错误的。我们需要统一的这种设计模式来实现我们这个多样性的设计。
And that should be possible because if you look at the 20th century modernism started in the 1920s. There was Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius met in the office of Peter Behrens in Berlin in 1915, and they had ideas and an understanding of the industrial civilization, the industrial city. The Bauhaus was founded, where they expanded from urbanism into architecture, into industrial design. A very, very small group, a series of experimental buildings in the 1920s, Riedfeld's Haus Schröder, Villa Savoy, the Barcelona Pavilion, the Bauhaus, and then it started the rollout. And when Mies, Kolb and Gropius met again in the 1960s, for instance, 65, they were still alive, they're at the top of that field, they had changed the physiognomy of the whole planet. The whole world has been transformed in what they've created, and they were able to convince the whole discipline. All architects were modernists. They created Brasilia, they created cities, they created all the buildings, all the institutions, all the interiors, furniture, products, graphic design, everything was modernism. And everything was, the nucleus was in the Bauhaus, and there was this incredible rollout, a total transformation of the built environment. And if you, in 1960, yes, there was mutual criticism, everything had to be modernist, and of course there was degrees of freedom there too. But I wanted to say, there's an example where the discipline came together and made a huge impact and transformed the world. And I compare this to what we are looking at, this garbage spill and all the different experiments. We have not had any impact at all in the last 30 years. Really, we created fragments here and there, but we have not made a coherent impact.
就是这种高度统一、这个连续性高的这种设计模式，在现代主义我们已经实行了，已经实现过了。所以这个参数化主义作为单一的设计形态，其实有很强的可行性。
So that's an invitation. We need to have an open discourse about the convergence, but it's not arbitrary. It's not just that we all work in the same style. I think again, to some extent, nearly everything which is done is now still modernism. You can't have just one style, modernism, and think that you can create this order. It will still fall apart. It can't be everything now postmodernism, that is just collage and garbage. It can't be deconstructivism, because that didn't deliver continuities and intricacy, and didn't have gradients, didn't have resonance, didn't have scripting and transcoding. So I only know one solution, which is parametricism. That's what we have to converge on.
所以这个跟之前的这个现代主义结构主义做对比，我认为只有一种方法能解决这个我们现在设计中的问题，就是参数化主义。
So the first premise, of course, convergence. We need to debate and discuss the most productive principles. The second question is then convergence onto what paradigm? But I would argue that parametricism is the only paradigm which has a relatively large group of the best and brightest protagonists of the discipline working consistently now nearly for 20 years, and that is very important and means something. So I think what you saw, all the projects we have created, many others, that is already much more than the modernists had in 1930 or even in 1940. So I think we're in a good place to make the impact, but we have to know what we want and we have to start pulling together.
就是参数化主义，就是跟现代主义做对比。1930年时候现代主义做对比，我们已经跃出了很大的一步。然后我们作为设计者需要知道，就是如何把我们的设计方向汇合到一起，然后知道我们作为设计者的我们想要的是什么。
And so I just want to reflect on this, that it seemed we were on a very, very strong trajectory where nearly all schools of architecture, where most young architects were investing in this paradigm, all through the 90s and 2000s, and only in recent years there has been a lack of nerve, a dissipation of this, which I think has a lot to do with the economic crisis of 2008, political upheavals, and a lot of doubt started to spread. And I also noticed that in this school, for instance, 5, 6 years or 7 years ago when I was here, there was more participation in this paradigm than now, but it is across many schools of architecture. So that's why it's important for me to open the dialogue and discuss what parametrism means, that it is not just a fashion, as something fanciful, and but as something very deep with sociological depths and societal relevance, and I think a very profound new paradigm, which should not be discussed in terms of what is fashionable at the moment. So that's my challenge, and I want to open the discussion.
所以这个就是我们参数化主义在08年这个经济危机之后受到了一些干扰，然后就是即使是这个在美院我5、6年前来过。发现大家对这个参数化主义这个参与性跟现在相比越来越少，然后我希望这个加强这种参数化主义的这个推行，因为它并不是仅仅是一种时尚，而是一种解决我们现在这个解决设计问题的唯一的一种方法。然后我希望跟大家讨论一下这个参数化主义这个本身的问题。
Thanks. Yeah, okay.
Hi. 1 year already. My question is about parametricism. Parametric is not the first mentioned in architecture. It is mentioned in mathematical philosophy by Wolfgang Gauss.
By who?
Wolfgang Gauss. The guy from Frankfurt.
Sure.
And he mentioned it is the whole system about the nature. So about design, I think parametric field is more like the whole system. And the question is, the whole system spent much energy here. It's like you have the design process, but you have the deadline here. So once we set up the whole system, we have to adapt all the conditions here. But once the condition change, the whole system will spend too much here. So how do we solve this problem? That's the first problem. And it's about design. And the second question is about construction. I believe curvature, creating connections, but I didn't believe creating curvature connections. We are in the contemporary world. It is already high civilization. Once we want to recreate natural system, it will be very dangerous here. I mean, this kind of dangerous is from the designer, the ambitions of architects. So maybe we will recreate some kind of transgenic food. Is kind of dangerous. We didn't see here, but the time will solve the problem afterwards. So how would you control this? How to control this in your mind? That's my two questions. And the third question is about the economic issues. How can you control and practice here?
Well, that's very heavy questions. Well, the first thing is, of course, my phrase pragmatism is very specific to the design disciplines. So there's architecture, industrial design, urban design, but it's not expands beyond that. Of course, it is connecting to the computational empowerment of many other domains of society, which you find in economics and finance and science simulation. So the computational thinking and tools and algorithms and the idea of spontaneous order and emergence exists in many different domains. So that's very important, that we are congenial to a lot of research and development fronts in other domains. But the phrase pragmatism is specific for the design disciplines. It's a design paradigm and style. So that's one thing to remember. Yes, it's congenial, it's connected, but it is also not the whole system. It is, the way I use it, a definite category to describe the paradigm and style of architecture for the future. I forgot the second question. No.
About the recreating.
Okay, there's also misunderstanding. This is not about recreating nature. This is about creating the city of today, the city of the future, which is very dense, very large, very intricate, very complex, with many audiences, many users, very dynamic, ever-changing. And there is a strong analogy to natural systems. And they're coming, but it's not more than that. It's not the attempt to imitate nature, to feel and look like nature. It is its own new artificial creation, but it is based on the analogy of self-organization, of swarm formation, of emergence, global patterns emerging of local rules, because that's the way a natural system emerged, because they're never top-down, they're always self-organizing bottom-up, and that's a very, very empowering analogy, but it's nothing more than this. We also have to be very open-ended with the outcome, the unpredictable outcome of this built environment, which doesn't have to look in any naive or simple way and fulfill an expectation of a nature look. That's not the case. I also want to comment on your question about curvature. Curvature is something which we need to look at in terms of its high performance possibilities. For you, it's easy to understand for circulatory movements, for certain optimized structures like shells, but it's more than this. It is very, very strong, empowering with respect to maintaining legibility in the face of complexity. So if you start piling things together and you have very complex trajectories to be maintained, curvature, the convex concave, the continuity of a curve is very, very potent and empowering to maintain legibility of a figure. So if you have an envelope and you start pushing and making space because it's versatile and flexible, if you make it in a block form, it's much easier to maintain unity than if this kind of breaks open with edges and corners. The figure falls apart. So the curvature here is, and you find that out when you work as a designer and you try to build something very complex with many functions, many adjustments, many recognition of complex site conditions, trajectories, entrances coming into your project. If you don't have curvature, you generate as deconstructed as chaos. That's what we have experienced. And when you're designing problem solver, you will find the superiority of the curve as a problem-solving device. Anybody else? Yeah.
I just have a question regarding to, I agree with you saying that in the 21st century we are living, a culture of conjunction. But I do realize in places like Portugal or New York or even Beijing, the class city usually brings more, let's say, a very high economic value, because that's an implication of, globalization. So I think in this sense, how do you think?
What kind of city did you say? Class city?
Like a clash, like a city with like a place like in New York, you can see building that looks like from the east or from everywhere else in the globe. So that's like I think it's the interpretation of the globalization of the world. And
clashing, you mean?
Yeah,
clashing.
yeah. So what do you think as a designer? What do you think is the practical way to unify the authentic principle?
Okay, the way I see this is, the clash city is the best thing we've got now. Right? I don't want to go back to something very minimalist, clean Brasilia, or I don't want to have David Chipperfield master plan. That would be a nightmare, right? So it's not about order only. I'm talking about very complex variegated order, which maintains all the intricacy, the differentiation, the variation, the richness of nuance, which we now find somehow registered. But we find it registered in a very corrupted, degenerate, and quickly illegible way. So that's the task. There's no example I can point to you. And so I can also start self-criticizing some of our projects. For instance, Galaxy has many advantages. There's a three-dimensional simultaneity of things, a lot of vistas, but it has much more monotony of expression than I would like, for instance, right? And it is also, of course, and it is relatively, it's not embedded enough in its context. These are conditions, of the particular conditions one could criticize. This is what also has to do with planners, and this has to do with certain stereotypical forms of development in terms of parcels separated by large streets. All these things need to become critiqued and questioned. So, there's a lot of self-critique potential in what I'm talking about our own work, the limitations of this work. So this is a very speculative, future-oriented lecture and vision I'm giving you. But I'm just giving you hints and pointers to in which direction a solution might lie. And I think that, again, collage and clash is still a good starting point. That's positing the problem. You have already several things going on a site or in an area, and now an entrepreneur comes in and sees an opportunity to add a hotel in the middle of it, or to add a retail system. Maybe he wants to connect all the lobbies. This should be quite open. And this entrepreneur should be able to make a proposition to the existing owners and bring an architect in to tease out the potential. So these things would be superimposed, they would be clashing, they would be on top of each other and ever changing, but they would now be, these elements would start to come in like a new species settling in an ecology, and there will be rules where you find them and how they adapt and connect to, and it wouldn't be like throwing garbage. It would be like growing one onto the other with the spirit of sensitivity, of resonating, of adapting, for the sake of the performance also of this new institution. The new institution wants to articulate that it connects to something, so because you want this connection is a functional connection, you want to express it. If that is an ethos, and if we have the skills and talent and intellectual ability to do that, then it is great. But also if at the same time, as these individual interventions build up a path-dependent identity formation. So I think that if we allow this process to happen, it wouldn't be that all cities are the same. They are very different. They just look the same as garbage. And there are two not unique enough. And what I'm talking about is, I'm talking about a condition where you have, after a while of this, somebody started something, and then others accentuate that, connect to this. Somebody else started something different here, the linear element, and now everybody works off the linearity. So after, even under the same principles, in the same style, these two cities will become very different. You see, the river will push through its shape onto the whole city. And here the mountain will push through. So even natural elements would be drivers for path-dependent emergent identities. So you have unique urban identities. These places will be very original and different. They wouldn't become the same. But they would at the same time be coordinated. But also, 30 years later, they would have transformed into something unexpected. But you would still find them yet again different. And the same would go for the different parts of these structures. They have an overall global identity, they have district identities, etc. But nevertheless, we expect that this district of the city would be still recognizing as its district. So that's the vision. And I think we can, it's difficult to talk about it because there's no example for this, but on a low density level, the vernacular interventions into landscapes are sometimes like this. I'm not sure if I have them here. Yeah, here. So you could say, in the vernacular condition, you have the human settlement is just like another species. It is not, because it is constrained by gradients, by slope, by conditions, and is not the independent, universal glass box with a machine at the bottom which can stamp itself everywhere and spill like garbage everywhere. We learn from nature, biomimicry, and we learn from kind of the vernaculars of this world because they're much more organic, constraint-based, sensitive to economic constraints, to energy constraints, so the human settlement is just like another, the agriculture pattern fits in just like kind of animal settlement, really. Another vegetation, and that's the spirit in which we should develop. Of course, not so sparse. We need to create this on a level of density. So this is not to show you this as a romantic, going back into nature and to small scale. This is just showing how diverse vernaculars have been, because they worked with particular constraints. They were sensitive to sun direction, rain, to many, many different things. So these are the different species of human settlement. And you could also imagine that these villages could kind of come together, but they come together in, let's say, this kind of three-dimensional density of something like this. This is maybe the condition. So that's the vision. How do we work on this? I don't know, but I mean, I'm starting to think about, I'm trying this right now at the DOL, and I tried it in Yale, to build up a big urban site and have different students independently developing ideas and positing and trying to develop that organic ecology and see if we can create it. It's very hard, I realized. In Yale we have two projects, they both failed. One became a raw garbage, the other one became one monotonous, clean, single author thing. So we have to, it's tough, but I'm starting to try experiment in the academic arena how this might pan out and work. And of course it needs a very, very sophisticated discourse and skill level to do this. But I think it's doable and possible. So it starts with a clash, and then these juxtaposed entities, they start to work with each other, grow over each other, inflect each other, resonate, recognize each other, become sensitive to each other. That would be what we demand of each other. We wouldn't respect an architect who comes in like a kind of garbage, brutal, ignoring, not making connections, cutting connections, making himself autonomous. That would be not respectable, shouldn't be respectable anymore. It would also shouldn't be respectable to have something very, very sterile and minimalist, which doesn't recognize the internal complexity of institutions. So we need to start to be tough with each other. But if we are tough with each other and don't respect each other, it's like an evolutionary selective Darwinian process. We generate complex order by leaving behind all the unviable mutations, and we are kind of growing a kind of intricate organism. But through a discursive selection process, and when there's something discovered, a new mutation which has potential, we are also happy to imitate. We're not stuck up, oh, this is yours, I do mine. No, we sharing. There's an open source process of amplifying discoveries and cutting out and eliminating vain and fallacious and primitive versions. So we need to have that discursive spirit. We can't just say, oh, you do yours, I do mine, I don't care, we're all independent, don't stress me. Then we don't have a discipline. Then we should all go home. We shouldn't write books, articles, or go to school. But there is this fallacious, pluralist discourse spirit. And we need to ramp up and be tough on each other, but also be generous and give credit and be open source with each other and imitate each other with respect to good ideas. And then, of course, also there's always research and development for new ideas, because it's like the endless form of nature, unpredictable and open-ended, but always principled and organic.
So, what you're saying is that as young architects or our generation, our job is to sort of, not like the CIA, build a new sort of a rule and principle and work together towards.
I mean, you start with particular projects, you vet in the context, and you do context sensitive. Look at our Korea project, and I think it has a lot of qualities, a lot of potentials, coherences from inside and out, a lot of variety. But I can also criticize, maybe it's still too monotonous. It doesn't express structure, which is a recent interest of mine. It doesn't express environmental sensitivities. So there's always, you can do more, and so it is a critical engagement. And you do one project, and I was hoping, in London for instance, at the moment they're doing literally 250 new towers and another 300 more projects. So there's over 500 projects going up simultaneously. You see the cranes everywhere. And there's another 200, 300 in planning. So if these architects would belong together and would be relevant to each other and would be part of a discourse and teamed up and skilled up, this could already, after 10, 15 years of this kind of intensity of development, really impact and transform certain districts and become a kind of signal. At the moment, there's all this opportunity is lost because the pervasive style at the moment is neo-rationalism. It's very trivial stuff we could have designed 70, 80 years ago. There's nothing original, nothing new. It's all too much planning preventing this. There's standards, density standards, distance standards, all sorts of, I think, arbitrary imposition which hamper this potential. So it's all wasted. That's what I see. But I think if it is first and foremost the battle of ideas at this point. And we can do projects around the world, but this will never be more than a drop in the ocean. And I'm getting impatient about this. I can do this, it's great, good project, but it's misunderstood. It's dismissed as being exuberant or stylish or self-indulgent or iconic. We don't want these things to be iconic, we want these things to be kind of impactful and generate and regenerate urban districts. But of course, we are the only the first ones to create a kind of unusual principled piece, it will be conspicuous. But that's not its purpose. Look at Mies van der Rohe's Seagram's building, how an alien invader this was in 1958. And look back 30 years later when the whole of Manhattan was rebuilt in its image, where now a normal visitor to Manhattan wouldn't recognize the Seagram's building because it's just, that's what we want, that's what we like. So we need to start somewhere, but I find it not interesting just to just focus on one firm and we do a few more speckles. That doesn't make an impact, that doesn't change much. Okay, you have here and there an interesting project, but that's not that interesting. compared, I'm thinking of Mies, Korp and Gropius standing in 1966. So it's like, yes, we did something. And this is still, you know, this is Bauhaus, this is Bauhaus, this is Bauhaus. I mean, everything is still modernist in a sense. So they made a dent, and I want to make a dent too.